something about me first. So the first thing I want to say is I'm a father, 2 children, sort of on the cusp of adulthood now. And I've been working in this field to engaging with fathers, supporting their relationships with their children, roughly since I became a dad. But my history is also as a social worker. I was involved in setting up and running the Fatherhood Institute as well, which is still around, whose job is essentially to support the type of stuff that you're doing, actually, to support you to engage well with fathers for the benefit of their children, to engage well with men in families. And it looks different now than it did 15 years ago, I can tell you, and different from when I was first a father. I'm going to talk a bit about that, about what's changed and where we are now. I think when we were first starting with the Fatherhood Institute, we were still at the point of explaining why it was important to engage with fathers. I don't think there were various answers to that, and some people hadn't really even asked that question. So the how was sort of somewhere further down the track. So I think we've come a long way since then, but I still think it's worth talking about, partly because this is still quite new. I mean, in the history of the way that our society looks after its children, you know, the way that fathers' roles are changing, it's happening sort of now, it's happening very recently, and we're still coming to terms with it. So it's not surprising if we should still be thinking about why and what are we trying to achieve, as well as the how. So I want to encourage you to ask those fundamental questions, because I think it'll help. So, and why is affected by how we see fathers. Some fairly random photos that aren't really meant to tell you anything much, except that it varies. Fathers vary, but how we see fathers vary. And it'll be different for all of you as well. And I'd encourage you to think about that, not just about the messages that you get or what you think the research is telling us, but what does it mean to you? Because that'll affect, and it's the same when you work with mothers, but what does engaging with a father mean to you? What are you bringing into the room, as well as what is he bringing? So think about that too. Fathers vary. So this list, this goes back some way, as you can see from the date, 2003. But it's essentially still current, and it's a way of saying that fathers vary, that the relationships they have with their children vary from family to family, from moment to moment, but it's all important. So, you know, all fathers matter one way or another to their children, whether they live with them, whether they're confident, how much they see them or don't see them, whether they're running away from their responsibilities or embracing them, you know, how young or old they are, how they're getting on with the mum, is the mum around at all, how well off or not well off are they, you know, all these sorts of things. They all make a difference. But they're about, well, what's that relationship like, and how's the child benefiting or not from that? It's more about that rather than, well, is this someone we want to work with? They're all people we should be working with, because they all matter. Fathers matter. You know, children can be brought up without a dad and do perfectly fine, actually. It might sound a bit odd me saying that, talking in this session and from the Fatherhood Institute, and I'm a dad, but you know, fathers can do fine without a mum. It's not easy, and mums can do fine without a dad if they have other people around them and people in their family, people like you, to support them. So, but that doesn't mean that fathers aren't really important. Okay, so this is in no way about criticising or undermining the role of single parents. It's about looking at the role we can all play. And because fathers matter, services to support them are essential. So, and that's why we're here, isn't it? Fatherhood is changing, has been changing over the last generation or so. So it's changed in popular culture, in the media. There's a lot more images, and I would say the images are, generally speaking, more positive than they were. But there's also a lot more talk about fathers in policy and guidance for the sorts of services that you run. It's less, 25 years ago, didn't really come up. You know, there was talk about parents and let's be inclusive, but let's think specifically about fathers and make sure that we engage with them whenever we engage with a family. That wasn't around. That thinking is relatively new. And it's still feeding its way through into training. So I'd be interested actually in how many of you, when you were doing any sort of professional or vocational training that you've done up to now, have had previous sessions or input about father-child relationships and how to support them. So hands up, who's had some of that stuff before? So yeah, like I say, it's still feeding its way through. So I often talk to groups of social workers, for example. Some of them will say, yeah, we had a really good session about fathers. You know, in the fourth term, we had half a day talking about it. But I'll talk to another one and they've had nothing specifically. Of course, they had a lot of stuff on parenting, but that's not quite the same. So the way in which services are provided is also changing. So I would say 20 years ago, there was very little focus on helping fathers to feel welcome. And that's starting to change too. And I'd like to hear from you about how you're doing. You're definitely going to get a chance to talk about that. My experience in working with the Fatherhood Institute was that we certainly didn't have all the answers. No one did. And what we were trying to do was create better answers. So, and that's still what we're trying to do. It's coming out of the closet. We're talking about fatherhood more, thinking about fatherhood more. And I think as a result of that, our thinking has improved. We're less likely to make assumptions, to see fathers as, you know, before we've really got to know them actually, as uncaring, not that bothered, not that good at it, incompetent, not very important, marginal, but in other ways powerful, you know, thinking about gender dynamics, gender inequalities, and potentially abusive. It's not that all of those things aren't true of some fathers, of some men, but I think we're less likely to make assumptions than we were. I think we're more able to see fathers. And it's also true that we're learning from research about what fathers can offer. The potential there for fathers and mothers to offer caring to their children is actually hardwired, perhaps not surprisingly, for both of them, for fathers as well as for mothers. But a lot of parenting skills and attitudes, the way in which we parent, is actually learned as well, as in other areas of our lives. So there's potential, but there's huge scope for learning, and that's true equally, really, for fathers and mothers. Roles are changing. The way in which parenting is carried out is changing. Fathers are doing a lot more hands-on care than they used to. As I said, our systems for engaging with fathers and supporting them, they're changing too. When I became a dad, there was no paid paternity leave. There was in a lot of European countries, by no means all, but there was none in this country. So what did that say about how we as a society valued fathers? But that's changed. Now we have, well, it's a much better system. I also want to say, the last thing on this slide is we've got to be careful in thinking about why we want to engage with fathers. Careful about, well, because I think people give different answers to that question. Is it because fathers are different from mothers? They bring something different and special to the party, to their children. There's actually not a lot of evidence to support that. It's not that they're the same as mothers, we're all different, aren't we? But fathers aren't different in specific ways that are important for children's development. It's not that men and women are the same in our society, but those differences aren't very significant. They can be who they want to be, and it's fine for their kids. That's the point. The idea of fathers being excluded from services, from active parenting in one way or another, that's around, and there may be some truth in that in some ways, but that sort of discourse focuses too much on the adults and not enough on the children. We need to think the reason we're engaging with fathers is for the children. If anyone's excluded, it's them. from a strong relationship with their father. So, the idea of role models, fathers as role models. Yeah, we can all be role models for all sorts of people. I'm a bit nervous about that idea, mainly because it's often thought of in terms of fathers and sons. Okay? And fathers are important to their daughters as much as their sons. And role modelling also is often applied to men rather than women. And I think that suggests a rather narrow way of looking at the role of a man in a family for their children. So I would put that in the bin. Men are important to their children, but in all sorts of different ways. So lots of change. Lots of change. It's still going on, and it's different in different parts of the country. These are national figures. They may or may not apply in the same way to the people that you work with. But look at those figures. So, around the time of the birth, for the first baby, well over 3/4, 86%, in fact, nationally, of parents are either married or cohabiting at the time of the first birth. And of those, in those families, 93% of the dads attend the birth. So over 9 out of 10 attend the birth in those families, which is most. Fathers do a lot more direct childcare than they used to. The main reason for that is mums are working a lot more. 50%, and that figure's going up, of mums of 9-month-olds are now in paid work, full-time or part-time. Not all fathers live with their children, but about half of them, and this figure is going up too, see their children at least weekly. Attitudes are changing. Mothers' and fathers' attitudes towards men's roles, they're changing too. It's now the case that about 17%, and that figure is going down, of men believe it's man's role exclusively or mainly to earn the money for the family. And that's halved over the last 30 years. Fathers matter in all sorts of ways to their children, as I was saying. This list is not different for mums. I'm not saying that everyone parents the same or is equally effective, but the potential for being a positive part of your child's life and the outcomes that can have for them is the same for mothers and fathers, and it's very broad. I see this as very much a good news story, the huge resource that men can offer to children. So not all parenting by dads is positive, as we know, and that has a huge impact too on children. And again, it's not hugely different for mothers and fathers. Where fathers are in conflict with the mother or the child, or their parenting is very harsh, that can have a very powerful impact on children. If they're just not interested, that has an important impact on children too. If a father is depressed, that has a huge impact on his relationship with his child and on mothers' relationships with their children too. So we parent together, don't we? Even if we're not living in the same household. Parental relationships also impact the way in which, couple relationships I mean, the relationship between the parents impacts on the way in which we parent and how that affects the children. So it's all important. And it affects fathers affect mothers' relationships with their children in a range of ways too. So they're not just important because of their own relationship with their children, they're important because it affects the whole system, the whole family system. And in all sorts of ways. It affects child-mother attachment. When a father is strongly involved and supportive of the mother, then that affects the mother's bonding and attachment with their child. The father's attitude and behaviour in relation to breastfeeding strongly impacts on whether breastfeeding is initiated and sustained as well. So they're very important. If we're thinking about mothers, fathers are very important. The way in which fathers parent is also self-supporting. If fathers are very involved early on, then it helps them to become more confident. It helps them to develop sensitive parenting skills and be more motivated too. So getting stuck in early, that's the basic message there. It makes a big, big difference. And it makes a difference to the dad too. They're happier as a parent, more satisfied, more confident. So it's good for everyone. So what should services look like? Separate services for fathers, as opposed to integrated services, all in the same pot. one thing I think it's worth holding on to, which I think is fairly obvious, but it's probably worth restating, is that the way we're put together physiologically obviously impacts on us as individuals, as members of a gender, as members of different groups, but that can't be completely separated off from other sorts of personal and social influences. So, for example, you were talking about hormones, and the way in which hormones, the hormones we have flowing around our bodies are affected by everything that's going on around us. So, and there's something in what you're saying, but it's also true that where men care for young babies, they tend to have more oxytocin flowing through their bodies, and that affects how they feel and it affects their behaviour. But you look at the average man, and he will have relatively little of that, because especially very early on in his role in his life as a dad, because he's having relatively little contact with the baby. So these things aren't set in stone. And there's lots of, just back to the services, so there's lots of partly because there's lots of different needs that dads have, that families have, that children have, and partly because, life is just complicated. There's lots of different angles on this question. But I think it is true that they're never enough. I just want to emphasise that. Maybe I'm 10 years out of date, I don't know, but 10 years ago, I quite often came across services that were running a dad's group, or they had a worker whose job it was to engage with the dads. And they actually felt quite good about that, and that was okay, but sometimes they felt too good about it. They thought that that was enough. So, but how many dads were they actually reaching? And what about all of the other dads and the dads that may not want to have that sort of separate service approach? And what about thinking about all our services from the point of view of, do they support father-child relationships? Let's interrogate all our services, and that's the services for mums too. So it's not something separate in that sense. A different part of our brain engages when we think about what we do with fathers and why that's important. So it's risky to have separate services, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. We just have to guard against certain ways of thinking about it. That's all. So it can be a way of putting men and men's parenting role in a box. So let's keep it out of that box. We don't need to put it in that box when we have a separate service. We can decide to have separate services for specific reasons, and that's absolutely fine. But that doesn't mean that our mainstream provision shouldn't, our universal provision shouldn't be responsive to father-child relationships too. It can only ever reach a small number of dads. If you have a separate service, it's just the way, that's just the world that we live in. And in some ways, it's not sustainable either for that reason. It's always at risk of falling off the back of the lorry. So be careful about it. It can be important. Like a bike stabiliser is important when a child is learning to ride a bike. We're learning to reach out to men. I think we're still learning how to do that. And having a separate service where the fathers can learn about engaging with that service, and we can learn about engaging with them. There's nothing wrong with that. So as long as we do learn, as long as we make good use of it and think about what it means, and it won't necessarily stay the same. So what can it do? It can help us as workers gain in confidence and experience, and the dads themselves. We can build up a sort of a head of steam, some momentum. We can get some good results. We can get some good insights and build on them. We can show others that it's possible, others who may be sceptical about it or unclear. So there's lots of good reasons to do these bits of work. The men themselves who engage with it can then take that learning out and that enthusiasm out into the community, hopefully, as well. So it can be built outwards as well as inwards. So it's about making a start, I suppose. But not forever, I'm not sure. There's a question there, so I'm not going to answer that question. But maybe, just maybe, we'll always need to build various bridges into our services for fathers, mothers and children. And one possible bridge, and this isn't true just for fathers, is to have a separate space where for certain people who want it and need it. So, and that's okay. So, why are these services important? And what I mean by this is, what difference can they make, actually? There's good evidence now, thankfully, that parenting interventions, where men are involved in them, do make a difference to the father's relationship with their child, and actually to mothers' relationships with children too. So having both parents involved in a parenting intervention is, generally speaking, better than having one parent involved. And that also applies to fathers' engagement in early years settings generally. So it works. And it works in a number of different ways in terms of the benefits to children. So there's good evidence about that. It also works in the context of social care interventions, where there are concerns about children's well-being that are more serious, child protection concerns. One of the problems that's identified in serious case reviews time and time again is inadequate engagement with the father, inadequate understanding of his role and supporting him to be a good enough parent. So you, as amongst all of your other roles, can be a really important part of the solution there to help fathers where the children are really vulnerable, to help services that need to know about them engage with them effectively. So that's going to be important in some of the families that you work with. And it will protect children if you do that systematically. So that's another good reason to engage with men. We were talking about all men, some men, all the different characteristics that men have, and how some tend to be less engaged with than others. So what percentage of birth fathers are known to social care, who are known to social care, are living separately from their children? What do you think? This is national statistics. 40? 55. Okay. So I won't take any more answers. 80. Now, we know that services struggle more to engage with fathers who live separately from their children or separately from the mother of their children. It's one of the reasons why social care services struggle to engage effectively with men who are significant in their children's lives. And I think it's a general point for your services too, to ask yourself the question, how well do we engage with those men? And how important is it to engage with those men? So I'm not going to answer that question yet. The next few slides are about being systematic. Okay? In most areas of life, it helps to be systematic. And this is no exception. So I was thinking about this and using the image of a bicycle to help me think about, I was just having a bit of fun really, help me think about the way in which services should be constructed, should be configured if they're going to reach fathers effectively. So what have we got? The frame. So this is the bicycle analogy. So leadership, top level policies, that sort of structure that, that's just there when you need it. The chain and the pedals. What drives it? The staff, actually, the people who work in the organisation. Recruitment, therefore. Who works there? What training do they get? That resource, all of you people here. The oil that keeps it going smoothly. The referral system. Registration. The initial information you get about a family, about the men in that family as well as the women. Record keeping. The wheels, forward motion, first contact. Visiting the home, them visiting you. How does all that happen? The bells and the lights. Reaching out. Publicity, outreach. How are you understood? How are you seen? Are you talked about? Do people even know you exist? Do men know you exist? And what do they think about you? The paint job and the saddle. The culture of your organisation. What it's like for men who, when they first walk through the door. Who creates that culture? Everybody. The staff, the mums, and it's out there too. It's not just created by you, it comes in from outside. And it's all important. The handlebars, I guess that's something about steering, monitoring, evaluation, changing direction, being able to respond to events, learning along the way. Getting near the end now, I'm not sure how convinced I am about the gears analogy here, but user involvement, really important. We know if we have a lot of gears on a bike, it can help us when we're going uphill and downhill. And I think the people who use our services, they're absolutely crucial to being powerful, being effective. So we're going to talk about all of those things in relation to fathers as we go through. There was a bit of research done about 10, 15 years ago, which actually identified 6 different stages in a service that was trying to engage with fathers becoming mature. So you start off in one place, and that's fine, and you move through a cycle to becoming essentially much more systematic. You're doing a much wider range of things. Okay, so this is stage number 6. Okay, so I can provide some information if you want and talk about the other stages too, but the reason I'm focusing on 6, apart from time, is this can give you a sense of direction. This is where you might want to end up. So it involves an agency-wide commitment throughout, top down, side to side. This is important, and everyone needs to know it's important and know why it's important to engage with men. All staff are responsible, all staff, all managers. So it needs to feed through into that staff recruitment that I was talking about. It can't be left to chance. The staff who you employ need to understand why it's important to engage with men. And if they don't understand before, then they need to understand by the end of their induction, and that needs to be reinforced as part of your fundamental culture. You need to find different ways of driving that cultural change. And I think one useful way, given our culture, which does tend to not focus enough, I think, on the impact that fathers can have on children, is to have a coordinator, someone whose specific responsibility it is to drive that forward within an organisation. Maybe 10, 20 years from now we won't need that, but I think at the moment we still need that. Systematic registration of both parents, right? So that's just routine, every family. Doesn't matter whether mum or dad are living together, that's just what you do. And that's something you explain, and if you don't get that information, I think you should be asking yourselves, why haven't we got it, and does that matter? And what can I do about it? And that should be part of a conversation, therefore, with every family, because you're going to need to explain why that's important sometimes. And so you need to understand why it's important. Engaging with fathers and father figures at every transition point in a child's life. So not once or twice, not antenatal and then, well, maybe a bit later. No, every transition point. So that's a lot of work, actually. And it's not just about engaging with fathers, it's about engaging with both parents sometimes, looking at their parenting relationship, looking at their couple relationship. So there's a lot of different angles on this. Responding holistically to the needs of different groups of fathers. So that's partly about diversity and partly about looking at the whole person, both in terms of how we engage and in terms of what impact everything in that man's life has on his parenting. Not seeing him too narrowly. Effective referral and signposting, obviously. Acknowledging changing gender roles as well. So thinking carefully about what those roles are like in that individual family and acknowledging that they may be different from the assumptions that we might make, and different or the same as what's going on in other families. Referral and signposting, monitoring and evaluation. The next 2 slides, I'm not going to hold them up for long, but they're an example of some initial publicity material in a service that was just starting to try and make some powerful statements to men and women in the local community that we're a service that's for men too. They wanted to get that across. It hadn't been true historically. They wanted to change how they were understood. So they started thinking about why it was important and how they could communicate that. And in the process, they talked to both mums and dads about why it was important, and they were involved in constructing the publicity material that you can see here. Mums were involved in this too. you can't really support dads, obviously, unless you recruit them in the first place. You know, engage with them. Those men that you're not in touch with yet, you want to get to the point where now we're in touch, now we're in the room together. So that's, you know, it's still the hardest thing. Getting the whole team to buy into that. So all those different touch points for a family, everyone has opportunities to, you know, some of which are taken, some of which are missed to engage with men. So, you know, health visitors, receptionists, nursery teachers, so we all have a role to play. You know, bus drivers, caretakers, everybody. There's no substitute for building a relationship, a personal one-to-one relationship with, and this isn't just about dads, but it's very important for dads, particularly those dads who aren't too sure whether they want to take that first step for all sorts of different reasons, because of what they think about your service, even if they haven't engaged with it yet, because of their own views, I suppose, about their own role, about whether your services are a female space. You know, is that how they conceptualise it? There's lots of reasons why they might be a bit uncertain. They might be worried about feeling judged or questioned. They might be worried about being the only dads in the toddler group. You know, lots of different things. They may have a lack of confidence or concerns about their own parenting. You know, and a lot of this could be true for mums too, obviously. But building a one-to-one relationship so that you can create a sense of trust and mutual respect is crucial to overcoming that, to getting them over the threshold. Be the person, all of you, be the person that dads can't say no to. So the idea there is that, you know, that you're enthusiastic, you know that there's something there for them, that you you know, you're holding out the possibility of some growth and change for everybody or every family that you work with. And I think it's really important to do that for dads as well. So you can be the person that's holding that, that's enthusiastic, even if they're not too sure. Okay, and they'll respond to that. And it's my belief, actually, and my experience, that they'll respond just as much to female members of staff as male members of staff. Not necessarily in quite the same way, and it'll be different for different men, but I've seen countless examples of men who end up engaged with the service because a female worker made it her business to engage with them and welcome them in, knew it was important and went out of their way. And that was the relationship that meant that they engaged. And that can, you know, that could be a male worker or a female worker. But I just want to say that to all of you, partly because, you know, there's relatively few men in the room here. So in fact, I think that's a good news story as well. We can all do this. So don't worry about that. It's fine, actually. So invite them in systematically. Letter, you know, not just face-to-face stuff, letters of invitation addressed to mum and dad. Not the parents. That's not strong enough. You need to separately name the dad. And it does make a difference. I'm going on about that not because I worked for the Fatherhood Institute, but because I've seen examples of local services where they stop using parents and they use mum and dad, and it doubles the extent to which, for example, health visitors meet the dads on home visits, and just by changing that little bit of language. But I think it is still true in our society that we don't tell men often enough, or emphatically enough maybe, that they're really important. And I think that's a good message for mums too, to feel that it doesn't all stop with them. You know, it's really, really important, actually, therefore, for mums to hear that message too, because there's lots of reasons why they might be feeling like, you know, I need to be the one who, I don't know, opens the letter, goes to the toddler group. It's more important if I go for my child. But actually, you know, if you can take a step back as a mum, then that could actually be good for you, for your relationship with your child, for your life. I've got one or two slides which give one or two examples of specific activities which are actually in some sense separate. You know, there are specific things set up for dads, even if they're taking place in a context where there are mums around too. And here's an example of one that was taking place in an early years setting, advertised well in advance. The main way they advertised it, well, I think two ways, but one was putting it in a newsletter, but I think probably at least as importantly, talking to the children and the mums about it too. So this became something that was coming down the track, that was going to happen, and it was going to be good, and it was really important to be there. So, and then there was a lot of preparation. The core of it was this box, a shoe box with some stuff in it that was sort of belonging to the dad, or that meant the dad to the child. So that stuff was gathered beforehand. So this wasn't actually just one activity, this was a whole series of activities. So you've got your shoebox with some stuff in it, and then that comes into the school, into the nursery, could be a school as well, and then gets talked about. So the child was talking about their relationship with their dad. Now, sometimes that can be difficult. I've come across some schools that, for example, in the past, I'm not sure how much it's true now, won't do or haven't done Father's Day activities because they're worried about children who don't have a father in their lives. It's a perfectly valid concern, or where they do have a father in their lives, but the relationship is really problematic. There's no absolute right answer to how to do it. And I think even if you do focus on men on a particular occasion, you could make sure you focus on relationships with women in the family, you know, not long after, maybe the next week or the week before, and talk about granddads and uncles and other significant men in the family as well. And give space, recognise that it'll be difficult for some children, and know enough about them to understand that and respond to that. But it'll be there. If it's difficult, it's already difficult, whether or not you do this. I think for me, that's the most important point, that it doesn't go away by not talking about it. So talk about it, but do it sensitively. So that's an example. I just wanted to read out that statement about impact. The dad's saying, she doesn't tell me anything about what she has done. That's his child, his daughter. I can ask her now I've been here. So it changed something about his relationship with his child, because he went into the school, into the nursery, and was able to spend some time with his daughter in that setting. So it created a space for them, and it impacted on what happened back at home. So it's important in lots of different ways that we don't always see either. So, and similarly, you could have a focus on Father's Day. So that's a possibility. Same sorts of issues come up. The reason I've put this here is because, look at the challenge. They had 25 replies saying, yeah, I'll turn up, yeah, okay. And 128 men came through the door. So that's, they're doing something right. And again, it impacted not just on the father's relationships with their own children, but their relationship with the school in this case, the whole setting, the way in which they came in and felt more engaged with the school. And here's another one. Now, this is a bit different. This isn't a one-off activity. It was an ongoing project that was done in partnership with a maternity unit in South London. They wanted to focus more, to reach out more effectively to young dads, young first-time dads, mostly African Caribbean. The first thing they did was have a worker, a project worker, based there at the antenatal clinic every week, one session a week, so it wasn't all the time. And their job was to make sure that they talked to the expectant fathers who came to the clinic. And they presented it as, we're researching how to set up a service that really works for you. And that was what they were doing, but it wasn't the only thing they were doing. They were also trying to create a relationship with them, a working relationship that could then be cashed in terms of ongoing contact with services. And it was very, very successful. They really responded to having someone pay some attention to them so that they didn't feel sort of, I'm not sure what I'm doing here and is anyone going to talk to me? So, and also because they did have questions and concerns and uncertainties, and to have some space to deal with that meant that they were more likely to engage as a parent and with services later on, rather than stay out of it, stay within their comfort zone. It enabled them to expand their comfort zone, I suppose you could say. But the thing that was difficult, actually, was early on at least, the attitudes of the services, who were not quite sure whether they really wanted someone in there talking exclusively to the men there, because they didn't know anything about these men. It wasn't what normally happened. So there was actually quite a lot of tension around between the different service providers initially. It took quite a long time to calm down. Not everyone was on board. So that's one of the reasons I mention this, is that, you know, you can sometimes there's a job to do to persuade and I suppose reassure other services about why you're doing what you're doing, and that it won't have negative consequences. I think they were worried about the impact on the women, actually, about, well, does she want him to be involved as much as you're trying to do? So there was some discomfort around that. This is taken from a similar project, Young Fathers' Experiences of Services, some positive, some really, really positive, and some not that great. The midwife was brilliant. She told me straight what I needed to do. The midwife didn't speak to me. I was left in the dark and I didn't like it. I didn't want to look stupid. I wanted to know. Social services assumed I couldn't cope. I don't think I would have been treated the same if I was a young mother. The reason this is up there is because fathers, just like mothers, you know, what you do makes a difference. It really does make a difference to their experiences. It can actually make a difference to their relationships, and it can certainly make a difference to how they engage with you. So they might not be expressing it, it might be hidden, but it's there. And sometimes, what is it they're not expressing? They might not, you know, or being clear about, being very, you know, upfront about, is ambivalence. They may not really know whether they want to come along to your service anyway. You know, I only went because my partner dragged me. You know, I didn't want to go into a room full of pregnant mothers who all knew each other. So that's one take. So understanding that, getting into, you know, under the skin of these fathers is crucial if we're going to engage effectively with them.